for the time will soon come when hobbits will shape the fortunes of all.
Prologues or even exposition dumps aren't a bad thing. There are countless examples of boring and lazy exposition at the beginning of films, but what we get at the beginning of Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring, despite technically being a very long 7-minute exposition dump, still stands as one of my favourite openings to any film ever. Why? That's the question today. Yes, I made a video analysing a scene in depth from The Lord of the Rings only 2 weeks ago, but we're doing it again because I feel like it, and because I've wanted to make this video for quite a long time now. I want to talk first about narration and tone, but let's start exactly where the film starts. We've got the credits on a black screen and a very faint chant. Then we get Galadriel whispering in Elvish. To which really we can say this film begins with the mood before anything else. Instantly we know this is a story with some level of mysticism and magic to it. We're introduced to the idea of a world with other languages in a way that doesn't force Elvish, and notably we're introduced to Galadriel, even if we don't know it's her yet. You know, we get to Lothlorien later in the film, matching this voice to her character, and that will enhance her sense of power and majesty, because we'll go, oh, she's the ethereal one at the beginning who seems to know everything, kind of thing. I think she's the best choice out of the characters here for narrator, really. Gandalf could have been narrator, but I think that would undermine A, him having to go out and study about the ring, and B, undermine the more humble, kindly first impression we're supposed to have of him in Hobbiton. Saruman would have been a bit too favourable to Sauron had he narrated, and Elrond is a very active character in the events of the prologue itself, so wouldn't have felt as omniscient and overworldly a voice as Galadriel here does. Also, Cate Blanchett is great, but anyway, Galadriel begins.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it.
We've got no visuals here yet, no information at all, just a sombre, faint chant like something lost from the past, and a sombre voice telling us the world has changed. That's emotion. Personally, I think a good prologue sets up emotion and mood much more than plot. We're feeling a sense of sadness here for something faded long before we even know what it is, and also a slight trouble about the future or present, because Galadriel feels something in the water, earth and air. Like this change isn't a completed one yet, but it's still ongoing, something is still stirring. Then we get the title, then actual exposition of the prologue really begins. This moment here before it is small, but it's crucial to set that mood prior to any information, because if we feel first, we care more to listen. So what is the exposition we then hear?
It began with the forging of the great rings. 3 were given to the elves, immortal, wisest and fairest of all beings.
I'm breaking it up a little to avoid copyright hassling me, but we get 3 to the elves, then 7 to the dwarves.
Great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls, and 9 rings were gifted to the race of men.
What I love about this prologue is that it wastes no words. You can see immediately how little we're actually told. No idea who forged the great rings, or why, or what makes them great. No idea why the elves or dwarves exist, or what they really are. We're just shown a shot that tells us elves have glowing skin and look a little ethereal, and that dwarves are short and bearded, and men are obviously human. And B, elves are immortal and the fairest of all beings, where dwarves live in the mountains. That's not the most deep description, but no point telling us anymore when we'll encounter both elves and dwarves in the course of the story. We can learn things later on, you know? This is just the basics here, and yet it's delivered in a still poetic, kind of language that would fit with Tolkien. I like visually how symmetrical the shots all are here. I like how an emphasis is on the rings more than the people themselves, but also how the camera kind of pans outwards throughout it all. We start with close shots of the elves, then further out and then further out until we fade to a fitting black as though the curtain falling on these men, and Galadriel adds the description,
who above all else desire power.
Too much detail and information would distract us from the theme. Power. A word that crops up quite a lot in this prologue because ultimately it's one of the integral themes of the story, hence the Ring of Power. We then get a brief shot of the map of Middle-earth to, again, emphasise this fantasy world and to introduce us without expecting us to study this map, before the shot starts fading again as Galadriel says,
But they were all of them deceived, for another ring was made.
I love the kind of glint of emotion she adds to that line as well. This is where I veer away a little to say that where exposition should serve to set up mood and emotion more than plot, and I guess theme also is kind of contained in emotion, it should also serve to tell a story in and of itself. You know, not just tell a plot, but a story with development and conclusion, and we get that here quite clearly. To the point you can break this prologue into 5 parts of a story. 1, the beginning with Sauron's deceit.
The Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring to control all others.
The resistance.
A last alliance of men and elves marched against the armies of Mordor.
Where they battle, Isildur comes close to death and the point is made.
It was in this moment, when all hope had faded,
that Isildur then defeats Sauron and wins the battle. The corruption.
The ring passed to Isildur, who had this one chance to destroy evil forever.
But, of course, showed the very desire for power we had hinted to us earlier. The loss, as basically the ring falls into obscurity following Isildur's death. It's found by Gollum, but we're presented with the idea of it hiding in the kind of deepest and darkest corners of the world and of life going on outside of it, memory forgetting it.
History became legend. Legend became myth.
Then the possibility, ending with a cliffhanger in fear for evil rising.
Rumour grew of a shadow in the east, whispers of a nameless fear.
But also hope, with a largely innocent hobbit finding the ring, something we're told the ring didn't want to happen, and that
the time will soon come when hobbits will shape the fortunes of all.
That is a story in and of itself. A threat, followed by a small victory, then a struggle to a greater triumph, and then a slow corruption towards an uncertain end. It's a story with a major theme of hope, where goodness can stand against the horror of the world, but also a theme of power, and how the very same goodness that can in one moment stand can also fall astray in the next. The prologue is a 5-part tragedy that ends with some very, very faint possibility of hope. It's this story that makes the prologue compelling. Anyway, if we go back to where we were, Galadriel says another ring was made, and we get a second shot of the map, this time telling us of Mordor as simply as we were told of the elves.
In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom.
That's all we see of it, a place of fire and darkness, and that
the Dark Lord Sauron
was there to forge the Master Ring. The imagery here and everywhere in this prologue is made more striking than reality because this evocative nature helps it stick in the mind much more. All these shots here of the ring and Mordor are engulfed with flame effects. But in about a sentence there we were introduced to Mordor, to our antagonist Sauron and the ring itself, followed by this iconic shot to bed in the idea.
One ring to rule them all.
And the emphasis on the ring is important. It's actually talked about more than Sauron because really the ring is the major enemy as this symbol for our inner corruptible nature where we're arguably our own worst enemies. The ring is a character itself.
3 lands of Middle-earth fell to the power of the ring, but the power of the ring could not be undone, and the ring of power has a will of its own. It betrayed Isildur to his death.
The Ring of Power is a very striking, captivating symbol, much more so than Sauron himself, who I know has more backstory in Tolkien's world at large, but really here is just a stock villain in many ways, a kind of ordinary figure and symbol of evil. It's the ring that draws us in as the audience, it's the ring that cements the theme, so it's the ring we should be focusing on. You know, apart from the narration, barely anybody speaks at all this prologue. Sauron doesn't, because I think that would remove some of his mysterious threat he has as a character. None of the elves, dwarves or men at the start do, unless you count Galadriel, but that's in the role of narrator. Isildur doesn't. Just Elrond first? There simply to draw our attention to Elrond as a means to introduce the character before Rivendell. Seeing him here enables him to later tell his backstory about Isildur, I guess. Secondly, because this is a battle scene here and there would naturally be a bit of shouting. And thirdly, because I think it cements the elves as a disciplined, well-organised fighting force of unity, whereas the orcs of Sauron are portrayed as a disorganised, almost primitive rabble. And that's also something good about this prologue. We get an entire battle scene contained within it. You know, action does draw people in as long as they have reason to care about it, and here we get action in a way that doesn't distract or delay the story, but actually informs it. Anyway, Elrond shouts, Gollum says... which emphasises the ring's corrupting effect in how much Gollum was poisoned into dependence on it, but also sets up the idea of calling it my precious. And then Bilbo speaks in his brief appearance.
What's this?
A hobbit. Bilbo Baggins of the Shire.
A ring.
Which I think is used to highlight how unintended Bilbo was in finding it. The casualness of his dialogue here informs his innocence, as does Galadriel calling him
the most unlikely creature imaginable.
Which is a bit odd when Gollum was also a hobbit, but I think she means unlikely for a hobbit to be there in the mountains, and just thematically I think it emphasises innocence finding this symbol of power much better. And that's pretty much it for talking. I love also how Gollum is kept at a distance in the shots, because as I mentioned in my video before, he has a 3-part story of being this monstrous creature in the first film, then someone we start to empathise with in the second, before his tragic fall and arguable redemption in the third. We're not yet meant to connect and empathise with Gollum in this film, so he's kept at a mysterious distance to us. Anyway, all of the talking here is purposeful, none of it distracting or even doing too much to introduce the characters here. You know, we can be introduced to the characters properly when we see them in the story. It's enough to just be familiarised with a few of them as they crop up here. One thing that always used to bother me about the theatrical cut of this prologue was that it cuts out Isildur's death. We're told the ring deceived him, then we see an orc ambush jump him, then he's dead in the river, and as a kid I always thought, how was that the ring's doing, you know, how was that the ring's betrayal? Surely he just got ambushed by some orcs. Where in the extended we see Isildur trying to flee the battle using the ring's invisibility, only he swims into the water and it loosens itself from his grip so that he does get spotted and shot, which makes much more sense. But on the other hand, I understand why it was cut down here, because there is a rhythm to film. And I think the length of this shot does kind of make it veer away. I've been thinking about rhythm in film ever since watching David Lowery talk about the round table scene from The Green Knight, where he says,
and I think I spent probably over a year cutting just this scene over and over and over again, trying to get the cadence of everything just right, finding just syllables that I could cut out or trim or move around, and trying to get that rhythm just perfect.
There's equally a great rhythm to the theatrical cut of this prologue, which is where the music is so crucial. Howard Shore did possibly the best film score ever, and also the fact, despite wasting no words, the prologue does take its time in the right ways. The many fades to black with silence dying away enhances everything here, not just the lost nature of this forgotten story of the ring, but also it gives space for Galadriel's words to truly resonate, not just the information but the emotion of what she says, and to properly separate the different emotional beats of this 5-part story. It's spot on rhythm, for example, to have it fade to black and pause as Galadriel says,
But they were all of them deceived, for another ring was made.
The point is, I said the prologue works because it's a complete story in and of itself, and I think the music and rhythm here both add to that. Like, the entire prologue is a mini symphony on its own kind of thing. That's important too. Overall, it's a wonderful opening to the trilogy. Exposition dump, technically yes, but one that labours no information, stresses theme, emotion and mood, tells a story of its own, gives us a battle, provides great rhythm, and whilst it might not tell us who Galadriel, Elrond, Bilbo or Gollum are, it does familiarise us with them for their later appearances in the story. So I guess I'm thinking if you want to do a prologue well, think less about what the audience needs to be told, and more about what the prologue would say were it a standalone piece. I don't think that necessarily means it needs to tell a complete story, because some prologues are much too short for that, but it still needs to have a kind of standalone statement. So, yeah. Any thoughts you have, anything I've missed or got wrong, comment below. Like the video if you did enjoy that, it very much helps, and keep subscribing if you want us to reach the 100,000 mark. We are getting very close now. Otherwise, support me on Patreon if that's your thing, or just hopefully see you next time. As ever, a special thank you goes to Devin, Kestrel, Arwen, Stephen Legg, Janice McMahon, Luke Hoare, Kshichu Kaber, Michael Gallagher, Samara Salsi, Sharikoff2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, Incomplete Sentience, Emily Tarras and Nicholas Patrick. Thank you.